Hello, Marilyn.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Marilyn. How are you?
Just fine. How are you?
I'm good too. Thank you.
Hello, Marilyn.
Hi
Good to
there.
see you. I took a class this week or last week for my renewal. I did the contract class that I have to do. And I just want you to know that I didn't learn anything in that class that you had not already taught me.
Well, good. I'm glad. That's good to hear that.
Yeah, it was a good class, don't get me wrong, but
Yeah, no.
it was, your teaching every month is just as valuable to me as anything I've had in a CE.
Well, good. I'm glad. We're going to touch upon something that's going on in your marketplace today before I start my session that is causing a lot of concern. And I want to make sure everybody understands it well.
Oh, good. Something to look forward to.
Yeah, right. I have one agent in one of the operations, and instead of his name, it says scared to death agent.
I can understand that.
And he's really not. He just does that just to be funny. But again, I think it's kind of funny when you see some of the labels on everything.
I get it. I mean,
Marilyn, good morning. I have a quick question. So on the KW Memorial system, there's like sample contracts and things of that nature. Since the contract the 1 to 4 has been updated, will there be any updates to the one that's currently on the intranet?
I don't know. I don't do those templates that you're referencing.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I'll check with Emily. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Has everybody checked in? I don't know. I haven't heard anything. Usually I see the QR code up there.
I don't see the QR code. Is
I
that
haven't seen the QR code yet.
Me either.
okay? Good.
It must be because I'm early. I'm rarely early. I'm usually just barely on time.
Well, I was raised by parents that if you were not ahead of time, you were late.
My parents raised me that way too. Somehow it just didn't stick to me real hard. I don't know what happened.
Well, I think it's individuals because I'm the youngest in the family and my brother and sister don't have the same time clock I have. So I just think it's, genetic.
I struggle with punctuality. I just struggle with it. And so when I'm early and on time, I just say, do that again, do that again.
Okay, well, I'm going to start sharing my screen since it's time now.
How do we, I guess, okay.
We will. There it is.
Oh,
it's now in
okay.
there. So let me get in. Checked in. Okay.
If anyone is unable to scan the QR code, then just go ahead and put your name and a good email for you in the chat, please.
When do you think we should get started? Give it a little bit more time.
We'll give it about 1 more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay.
Alrighty, the QR code is down. If somebody missed it, please go ahead and put your name and email in the chat. I will put you on our list. Marilyn, I'm going to go ahead and leave it to you. Let me know if you need anything from me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay, before we get started today, we're going to go through some things that are a little troublesome right now with our market. And what we're going to go through today is really, while I've touched upon it in light of the new contract changes, I just want to bring it a little closer to the buyer's agents about their best practices that they need to uphold and those type of things. But before I get going, I'm going to talk about the addendum concerning right to terminate due to lender's appraisal. And I'm going to pull that up. Hopefully I can get that out of the way. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, great. All right, number one, this form can never be used when a buyer is using FHA, VA financing, or cash. And we've had way too many issues where the listing agent is saying this has to be on the contract, and it cannot be on the contract. It is prohibited by federal law. I don't know about y'all, but there's a greater sense of making sure we assist our clients in complying with federal law. And to use a form that you know is not acceptable, I mean, it says it at the very top and here in the first paragraph. So please don't allow a seller or listing agent to try and get your buyer under FHA and VA to do that. I'm going to share one other thing with you too. Okay, can everybody see that? Third-party financing addendum?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay, if you look at paragraph 4 of this promulgated form, it says, if the financing described above includes FHA insured or VA financing, and that they mean from paragraph 1, it is expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provision of this contract, the purchaser, buyer, shall not be obligated to complete the purchase of the property described herein or to incur any penalty by forfeiture of earnest money deposits or otherwise. Okay, so because of that, there's no attorney that would ever draft any language. We're the reason that they actually had to tell you that the 3-day notice of termination requirements is not applicable to FHA and VA purchasers because they had not explicitly stated that when they changed 2B of the third party. So again, don't let anybody tell you to use the form incorrectly. Okay, so just be real careful about something like that. Okay, so again, we're going to go back to the addendum concerning right to terminate because we have too many people who are actually not understanding some of the provisions. And you have to have clarity on this as an agent representing your buyer. I've told you before, no buyer can do one or two without having the lender's written acknowledgement that they either, number one, have a blank check and they can make up any difference in the appraisal and still be individually approved, which is very doubtful in this market. You never, as a lender, I can't imagine that they would do it. But paragraph 2 is the one that really agents are missing a little bit to understand it. Okay,
Marilyn,
Pardon me?
Marilyn, we do not see that form.
Okay, that's what I
Thank you.
needed to know. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So again, no buyer agent is going to have their buyer mark 1 or 2 without the lender having given their advice to the buyer on what they can do, period. Don't take their verbal, put it back in writing to them if they've communicated to you through text or through a conversation with the buyer. Now in paragraph 2, 1 is deadly, it's a total waiver, period. If 2, they say, I'll partially waive it if these conditions exist, okay? So what they say is they're gonna waive their right to terminate if the lender declines the property in 2B, if the following 2 things exist. They both have to be there. There is an and, not a nor. So number 1, the property approval, the lender would always have to decline the property approval per paragraph 2B. And the opinion of value is X number of dollars or more. What has happened is that agents haven't paid attention to this and. That's why in that lender's requirements, the worksheet, I say, will the lender decline the property if it doesn't appraise for sales price? You need to know that going in. Here's what's happened. Let's take an example. The property was listed at 190. The sales price is 200, right? And so the buyer and the seller are in this and the buyer says, yes, I'll waive it. If the opinion of value is 190 or more, and the property approval is not obtained by the lender. Critical. Well, the opinion of value is 190 or more. And if the lender says, well, I'm not going to decline it, we'll just reduce it. And then the buyer has to make up the difference in the cash portion of sales price. So that's why only a lender can advise the buyers properly. And we don't do anything these days unless it's reduced in writing, period. Even if we visited with them, even if they're a family member or somebody very close to you, you're going to confirm everything that's agreed upon in writing. We're not going to make the decision. We're not the lender. The lender has a fiduciary duty to your borrower. They know these things. You do not. I just don't want your buyer caught in something where the lender says, oh, I won't decline the property approval. You'll just have to, I'm going to reduce the loan amount. You'll just make up the difference. That's going to be a problem for the buyer as well, unless the lender has said in writing that that's acceptable. Why do I want the lender's advice on what the opinion of value needs to be or more? Well, they know the buyer's approval. They know if the buyer is able to make up that deficiency between the appraised value and the sales price. So again, be very, very careful. Don't have the other party saying, well, you're not going to get the offer if you don't do this. And we've had that on VA and FHA, which is just horrible because it's very obvious that this form is never to be used for it. Can't use it for cash either. When do cash purchasers need to get their appraisal? During their termination option. Yeah, always, just to do that. But my concern is I'm getting way too many instances where this is happening, and the buyer's agents fail to see that word and that's really critical in this whole process. So make sure that you don't get forced into something, that you do cross all the T's and dot the I's when representing your buyers in the course of this market that we're in. If you have any questions, just interrupt. I'm not going to go to the chat because a lot of that is information for Emily.
I do have a question. I just want to make sure that I understand your concern. If a buyer has the cash and their lender has agreed they have the cash to go over that 190, and they could make up the difference between 190 and 200, checking 2 is not a problem. Where your concern was is when you didn't check and they assumed it was either or and they got caught. Is that was I want to make sure I understand you.
The buyer only can waive their right to terminate under 2B if the two things happen. If the property approval is not obtained by the lender and the opinion of value is X number of dollars or more. Both of those things have to happen on something like that. The situation we had is that the lender said, I'm not going to decline it, but I'm going to have to reduce the loan amount. And so now instead of a $10,000 gap, the buyer had a $20,000 gap. And you know, truthfully, I know how crazy this market is, but the problem is sometimes when a buyer says, oh yeah, I really want this property and I'm willing to do that, do they change their mind sometimes when the reality hits, when a property doesn't appraise? It does. And first off, we would never, ever, ever advise any buyer to buy a property that didn't appraise. I mean, that's a fact. We can't advise otherwise. We are tasked with saying we're a prudent agent, and that's what it means. We're going to err on the side of being cautious and not, can a buyer take the risk? Oh yeah, as long as you've got everything in writing, it is the buyer's choice. We've had too many agents who kind of gotten caught in this, and the buyer had to make up more, and they were upset because the agent said, oh no, you only have to make up the difference between this value and the sales price. So again, this market is one that makes us all cringe from time to time. And you know, I saw the cartoon, somebody sent it to me. The listing agent looked calm and collected, and the buyer agent had their hair on fire. Well, believe it or not, buyer's agents, I understand having your hair on fire, but listing agents in a multiple offer situation, I think they have so much liability and risk. It is not funny because everybody wants to blame the other party for them not getting the property. You didn't do this, you told me this, and that's not true. Do you know all those kinds of scenarios? So again, we just have to take a very deep breath and make sure that what's guiding us is the true way that we need to advise our buyers in the best way we can. So we're going to
Marilyn, I have a question on section 3 of the form. So they filled out section 3. However, they have amended the close date. So is it 20, I think they put 25 days from effective date. Does that mean that they would have to resubmit that form with a different date, or does that omit the option?
No, all the dates in the contractor addenda are based off the effective date. If they extend the closing date, that number of days in that paragraph remains. So if you don't modify that paragraph, fill in the blank for the number of days, the buyer will lose that provision. And that's happened too.
Okay, so I'm
appraisal.
Okay, I'm representing the seller. It is not my job to remind the agent, even though she did send the amendment to extend closing, it is not my responsibility to tell her, hey, your termination option is void, I guess.
No, it's not their termination option. It's it's an additional right. They still have 2B. And yes, as a listing agent, that's not what our duty is.
Well, she filled out 3 and that's it.
Yeah, that's an additional right. It doesn't take away from 2B. 2B is still a part of the contract. The lender still has the ability to terminate based upon the property not meeting approval.
Okay. And another quick question. I did get it in text message that they had talked to the lender, but I didn't personally see anything in writing as far as them saying, yes, we're going to go ahead and continue with the loan. Am I responsible for receiving that information, or is that the buying agents and their client?
No, you're not going to advise them about
Okay.
how they need to uphold it. The only thing could be, truthfully, is if your seller has concerns and says, can you verify with the lender that this is okay? If the lender will communicate it to you, that would be it. But if your seller wants that information, you can try and attempt to get it, and it's based on what the lender can divulge to you.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so what do you do when you first start working with prospects? We're going to talk about that. What information do you need to know from the buyers? What forms you need to review with buyers prior to an offer, and what questions do you need answers to from the listing agent? We touched upon this because of all the new contract changes, but we're going to kind of do it again. What do you do when you receive and execute a contract as a buyer's agent? And then make sure that everybody uses the buyer checklist and the time limits that I've provided and that type of thing for that. So what do you do when you first start working with prospects? Well, number one, you're going to provide the completed information about brokerage services. You're going to get them to initial and date. If they won't do that, I don't think you need to waste time working with them, because it's a notice that is required by law. I don't know about you, but we had lots of setups when this form first came out to determine if the agents were actually doing it at the first time that they visited with somebody talking about real estate transaction. No exceptions, none. Don't turn in a new home contract and tell me that you just got the IABS filled out when you had a contract from last June. We all know you violated all of the TREC requirements, much less your broker's requirements. So again, the other thing is at the same time, you're going to get the buyer tenant representation agreement completed. Why? Because you took a code of ethics. You took an oath to uphold the code of ethics. In the code of ethics, it's very clear. We reduce everything in writing with our clients, everything. Okay. So again, you don't want to be in violation of the code of ethics as well. And usually when we've had buyer's agents who've done things at the right time and the buyers complain, it's really great because the broker's able to open the folder and see everything that was done in a timely fashion, not just so that you could get paid. Okay, it has to be done in the right sequence of events. Number one, does the buyer have a property to sell in order to purchase this property? Well, that's kind of important to know that, because here's what's happening in this market. The buyers are either not divulging to the buyer's agent that they need the proceeds from the seller of property, or for some crazy reason, the buyer didn't even ask that question. The buyer agent didn't ask that. It's important because we have an addendum for sale of other property by buyer that should be on the contract if this buyer cannot purchase this property without those proceeds. Pardon me? Okay. Every good lender, or I'm just going to say every great lender, when they give you the conditional approval letter and they have the conditions that would need to be cleared in order for approval, really great lenders actually place that provision that the buyer would need the proceeds from the sale of the property, and they actually give the address. You know, those are lenders that are not afraid. They're really transparent. They're doing exactly what they need to do. What happened in this market is that the buyer knew how crazy the market was. So they really wanted the buyer offer to be accepted by the seller. So the buyer said, no, that's okay. We'll go forward and not have that addendum. Well, what it does is if that's a material fact and the other party asks you as an agent, listing agent as the buyer's agent, does your buyer need to sell their property and have the proceeds before they can buy this one? You can't lie. Just, you know, you have to be truthful about these things. We had one situation where the buyers and the lender withheld that from the buyer agent. I don't know about you, but I'd mark both of those boxes as far as never using them again. Number two, is the buyer currently under a lease in an apartment or house, and have they or would they have to give notice to a landlord for early termination or termination in order to close on this property? As a buyer's agent, that's important for you because you don't want to get caught up in any interference between a landlord and a tenant's lease. All of that needs to be tied up in a nice little bow and be able to be covered properly so that the buyer doesn't get down to the wire and then find out that they're not individually approved because the current landlord will not let them out of the lease. And they can't afford the loan on the property as well as the lease payments too. The other thing, will your buyer be allowed to grant the seller a temporary lease on the contract? This applies to buyers that are financing. Cash transactions doesn't matter. But on financing, the lender is the only one who can tell you the buyer can have a temporary lease, a seller's temporary lease of 30 days, 60 days, whatever the lender says. We don't come up with that number, only the lender.
Marilyn,
Mhm.
could number 3 also have a problem with homeowners insurance?
Well, it does because if you're not going to occupy the property, you have to have the endorsements showing that you're a landlord.
Okay, so if you are paying cash for a property, but you're going to grant a 30-day lease, it's in the best interest of the buyer to make sure their insurance will cover it, correct?
Oh, I would think so. Insurance should be taken care of during termination option.
Okay.
For a cash transaction, they can do whatever they want. They're not subject to a lender requiring that the borrower actually occupy the property.
But they're still subject to whatever their homeowner's insurance is on cash,
Oh,
correct?
if you're not occupying the property, your insurance agent policy better reflect that you
Okay.
are covered on something like that. We had a lot of those during the Arctic storm, where number one, the landlord did not have a provision that they were a landlord in their homeowner's insurance, and it gets really difficult. We're not insurance agents by any means. All we need to do is stay on top of them during that termination option and make sure that they've done that. My problem for you as a buyer's agent, if the buyer is allowed to give the sellers a temporary lease, number one, that buyer would have to know from you in writing, I cannot assist you with any issues regarding your lease. Once it closes and funds, I'm out of the picture. You are on your own. Do you want to be a landlord? I've got some great reading for you, and give them the big humongous printout that's from Texas A&M Real Estate Center. But again, we have too many times where buyers are first-time home buyers. They don't even know how to be a homeowner, much less a landlord. And the first call is usually to the buyer agent, and they want you to step in and make this right. That's not your job. That is not within the scope of your duties. And so what concerns me is that it shows me that the buyer was not told in writing where they acknowledge all of what they'll need to do as a landlord, and acceptance of them being a landlord. So again, that kind of revealed that this is something that's going on, and we just don't want to get caught up in the temporary lease, even between a landlord and a tenant. The other thing is that once the parties usually negotiate this at time of offer, because it's the best position for a seller to be in to try and do it at time of offer. Say the seller comes to the buyer 3 days before closing, and they say to the buyer, I want to remove this temporary lease. I don't need it. Well, can the buyer say no? Absolutely, they can. The contract will stand as written between the parties, because a lot of buyers, when they've made arrangements, they've had to pay things and extend things, and they're not going to let the seller as a tenant to be released from that, because they've jumped through hoops to accommodate the sellers needing this. So again, it's tough for the listing agents to communicate that well to the sellers, but as a buyer's agent, you need to understand that too. The buyers don't have to release the seller from that temporary lease as well, especially if they've made changes and those type of things. Also, the biggest concern I have for you as buyer's agents is you need to get clarity on what the buyer's wants and needs are for the property, and it needs to be in writing. Let me give you an example of this. You're doing your presentation, and you've gotten their criteria, their wants, and their needs. Put it in writing and put it and attach it to the buyer tenant agreement. We had a situation where the brokerage was contacted because the buyers were complaining that the buyer agent hadn't showed them all their properties. Yes, I understand the problems that we have with the settlement agreement with the Department of Justice. I'm sitting on a panel at Texas Realtors, and I'll keep you updated. They're asking us to review all of the forms that our association creates regarding this new settlement agreement between the Department of Justice. But what I want you to understand is you're going to put it in writing what their wants and needs are and a part of their buyer tenant agreement. Case in point, buyers were complaining. You know how buyers are. They roam the areas that they really like, and all of a sudden they see a property sign and they call the sign, even though we told them not to, right? They had to go through the buyer agent. They call the sign, and the agent that actually picked up that opportunity call said, look, if you come and deal directly with us, you'll be able to get this property at a reduced rate. You know, I'm just saying this is what sometimes has happened. So the buyer got upset because they wanted to be released from their buyer tenant agreement when they found out that this property, well, the buyer agent, because they had it in writing, signed by the buyer, what their wants and needs were. This was also their conditional approval letter was attached to the buyer tenant agreement, acknowledged that this is what the lender gave the buyer and the buyer agent as what their maximum allowable amount would be for a loan, all these things. And all of a sudden it proved that the buyer was not being discriminated against. They literally had their wants and needs in writing, and the buyer agent had provided everything that was in that range and what met their criteria. So again, put it in writing, put it on the buyer tenant agreement. You can do an amendment to the buyer tenant agreement forever. That's why we have amendments to those types of things. My concern for you is if you have not done this, you would be subject to them trying to say you didn't do your fiduciary duty, the best interest of my interest on it. Do buyers change their wants and needs? Oh my word. Let's just say that you're out there in this market that you have, and there are only 3 available homes to show them, and you take them to the first one. You already now know that everything they gave you before has changed. And it's crazy. The inventory many times makes the buyers readjust what their wants and needs are based upon what is available. So get out that handy amendment to the buyer tenant agreement and adjust what their wants and needs are. Getting the guidance and having their affirmation of you having in writing what they want is so critical. I'm going to tell you, years ago, I got a referral to work with some buyers. Did not know them. They came from out of the area, right? They gave me their criteria. You know how many phone calls you did with people to try and find out their wants and needs and send them information that would be available. And I did exactly what they told me. I don't want anything over this amount. Okay, so I had that in writing, right? I go out to show the properties, and the husband was very quiet. He was in the back seat. The spouse was his spouse was in the front seat with me, and we had seen about 3 homes at this point. He gets out of the last house. We get into the car, and he's standing in the back, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I must have done something wrong. He really looks like he said he had never had a real estate agent stay within that range of home prices ever in his whole life. He said, Marilyn, we're going to have to go back because, honey, I can go up to 750,000. Well, if you don't think I didn't want to put that car in reverse and get out of there and get back to the office, you were mistaken. I was doing what he wanted, and they saw that the market, what they were trying to see, what the market would bear in that price range, and it obviously didn't reveal what their wants were and their needs. So again, amend it often as you need to, but get it in writing. That's the best way for you to make sure that you've done a really good job. The other thing is If you are not going to be available at certain times on certain days, just because of your needs, make sure you communicate this. We had a Trek complaint just recently, and the Trek advisory letter that they put in the agent's file was that they felt that the agent needed to be more precise in when they would be available for the buyers. Okay. I don't know about you, but I know how buyers are. They'll call you and you're out showing properties to somebody else and your day is booked. And they said, oh, can you show us this property today at 1? So again, just make sure that if you have certain times where you will not be available, I understand when they're negotiating, you're under contract. Those are different types of scenarios. What I'm trying to hit upon is really prior to them going under contract, the availability on something like that. Any questions?
Yes, Marilyn, how would you suggest that you relay your availability?
In writing, I'd put it in special provisions and just say, please remember that after this hour on this day until this time, I will not be available to visit with you. However you want to put it, just put it in writing in the special provisions.
Does it help if it's in a signature in your email or no?
I like emails because they expedite everything, but if you put it in an email to them, they're not going to read that. You know what I'm saying? I want them to acknowledge it as part of how you will represent their best interest.
Makes sense.
Yeah, because
Thank
they'll sign that and acknowledge it at the time. You can even have them initial it, where you put it in special provisions, whatever you want to do, highlight it is fine. I just felt that after Trek, and Trek is being really unique on a lot of their responses. It seems to me that they're sending signals to us that they hold you to a much higher standard than what I'm not going to say historically we have been, but they're being more exact about what it is you should be doing. Do you know what I'm saying? And for years, our legislatures have been pummeled with, they want X number of criteria. We have to do this on every transaction. And Texas Association of Realtors has been excellent on combating that with our lobbyists. We never want a list because the moment we don't do one of those things on the list, we would all be subject to a violation. So again, just put it in writing between the parties. What forms do you review with the buyers prior to offer? Well, you're going to have your comparative market analysis, price opinion. You don't want any buyer to not know what's going on. Even if you said, look, there are no comps on your form, you can do that. But what I'm trying to get to is there are some forms that we use that come from other sources. The tax record for that property is important from the appraisal district. Number one, circle as many things that you can on there that they're acknowledging, including anything that would involve the contract 6E8 for a seller to give these required notices for the municipal utility districts, the PIDs, the LEDs, all those different types of things. Make sure you cover that with them. Circle the information. They can even initial within it, but that tax record is important because it's got a thing called square footage. And when it comes from an appraisal district, it tells you two things. Number one, have the sellers been paying taxes on this valuation? Yes. This was the data that was used to form that valuation. I don't know about you, but any seller that hasn't been paying attention to that didn't realize how important it was until they go to sell their home. Under or overage, both are bad things for a seller. So again, just make sure that you go through all of the archive information regarding this property if it is available to you in MLS, but that tax record is really important. You want to hit a bunch of features on that tax record. And now what I'm going to do, and I hope I do it right, we're going to share the general information and notice to buyers and sellers. Does everybody see that? Okay. This form was updated in 2018 to reflect a notice to buyers and sellers. It's a great document. The problem for it is too many times, because it's a broker required form, buyers agents send it over and don't review it with the buyers. They just want their initials and signature, that type of thing. And that is problematic for you because, and as I've gone through this a bunch of times already, the agents tell me, they said, this is almost like going through the contract with a buyer. And it's true. A lot of these provisions are covered in portions of the promulgated form. So it's not the first time they're going to see it when you go to it. It means something different on each transaction too. Because some things buyers tell you that they're very concerned about. And man, can you point to a paragraph here in this notice that says this is what you need to do and when you need to do it? It does. So my thing is, this is your form. You can highlight it just like I have based upon what might be applicable to this transaction. You can get them to initial all of these things. Anytime you bring somebody into initial something, it means they've read it before they put their initials typically. Some of the paragraphs I really like to highlight is that brokers and agents are not inspectors. The other thing is if they're encouraged to seek the assistance of an attorney because we aren't one, period. We don't act like one. Our scope of duties under our license is to act in behalf for real estate matters. It's not to give legal advice to our buyers. Environmental concerns, we have the lead-based paint addendum that is required by federal law to be on the contract. So we want that. We also have some great forms for mold regarding Texas Realtors. It's how do you protect your home from it. It's a very great document that you can also provide to your buyers. It's not hard to do that. And if it's not on the required list, doesn't mean you don't get to use it. Expansive soil conditions vary greatly in Texas. If you've got somebody coming from another part of the United States, they may not be as familiar with it. And so we also advise them that they should check with their inspector or other experts on how to minimize the risk of movement or what is the issues for a property based upon some expansive soils and those types of things. FERPTA, well, that is in our contract. This is really serious. This is paragraph 20. And what happened? Let me explain it. It says a seller should notify the buyer whether the seller is a foreign person as defined by federal law. Do you think that's 4 days before closing or do you think it's before offer? It better be before offer. No buyer should go into a transaction subject to this because the buyer agent is telling the buyer, look, if the seller is subject to this, you need to get with your CPA or your tax attorney to verify all this information. Well, guess what? When the buyer finds out that they have to complete the forms, get the proceeds from the seller at closing, sign the IRS form with their own social security number, and then send it off to the IRS, a little bit of the time, the buyers feel a little uncomfortable with that and think, I don't even want to be a part of this transaction. See, that's why you need to know this before offer, because otherwise it's not fair to a buyer. You can't just, nobody reads paragraph 20 in detail because there's no fill in the blanks. So that's why it's really critical. When I say this is what you need to know before your buyer makes an offer, absolutely. The worst thing for the buyer would be they've already paid, they're deposited their earnest money and their option fee, and they're in their termination option. They spent money on inspections, and then all of a sudden it is revealed to them that the seller is subject to it. I don't know about you, but buyers are not real happy about that, And, we can't tell them what they can legally do to the seller. They'd have to consult an attorney. But again, we've had some of these situations. I've told the good listing agents, where does it go? It goes in agent remarks in the MLS because it can't be on the seller's disclosure because that's about the property, not about the tax implication of the individual that owns the property.
Can I ask about that? How on both sides, I'm a new agent. I apologize. How do you ask that without, and the actual person knowing if they're defined by federal law, a foreign person?
Well, as a buyer's agent, you're going to ask every listing agent regardless, every transaction. You do not miss any transaction. And you're going to say, are the sellers subject to FERPA? You need to know that. Once they are, then you turn to your buyer and say, look, I'm not a tax attorney, I'm not a CPA, but here is what the contract says in paragraph 20. You will be responsible for getting those monies, completing those forms, and sending them all to the IRS.
Then how do you do that on the listing side? I know you're talking about buyers, but just out of curiosity, without being offensive, because it might sound like you're being prejudiced. Are you foreign? I mean,
Absolutely not. It's paragraph 21I of the listing agreement. It's there. No problem. You know, Texas Realtors, as I said, we're very fortunate. They provide really good private agreements for us. And as I said, I'm going to be involved in the one that helps update all of our forms based on the Department of Justice settlement with the National Association of Realtors. So I'll keep y'all posted on the various things, but a lot of our forms are going to change again. This is the year for form changes. So we'll just have to batten down the hatch. Now, what I am going to tell you is in paragraph section 5 of the seller's disclosure, the Texas Realtor seller's disclosure, the first question asks the owners, do you have flood insurance? The minute they do, it says attached TXR 1414. About 5 other statements also say. So again, I want your buyers to all sign and acknowledge it. Should the seller provide it? You bet. But if they don't, please do so to your buyer. That's the best way to go. Okay. Inspections. Inspections completed during any option period. Well, that's good advice. We should do that. Repairs. Before the option period expires, you need to negotiate all the repairs. I'll tell you, I think sometimes agents tell me things just to see my response, but I had an agent contact me and they said, the listing agent said that because we sent the amendment over before the 5 o'clock deadline, we're good to go. I said, no, until all parties sign it, you don't have anything that's contractually binding. Period. And now we have a lot of listing agents that are advising sellers, don't agree to the amendment because you'll be contractually liable for any repairs or treatments that you agree to. Why don't you just go ahead and do them? Well, now the buyer doesn't have anything to contractually get the sellers to do, the paid receipts, who did the repair, all of these kinds of things. It's a really crazy time right now. And I try to keep things a little lighthearted because I work in a world of very scary environment. And so it's kind of troublesome sometimes when we keep saying things, how people can get into trouble. But on something like this, that's absolutely absurd. Why would a listing agent say that except to trap the new agent? That's crazy. Walkthrough. Do you think you need a walkthrough before closing?
Absolutely.
Yes, we do. I'm going to give you an example of one of the most tragic events that happened, and a buyer failed to do a walkthrough before closing. It was a lot sale. E&O providers do not like land transactions. Many times they will not cover them. Even though we have E&O insurance, they just don't like land transactions because things are going. So here's what happened. Listing agent got the listing agreement, went out to the property, put their sign in front of the lot, right? Well, the association that maintains all the common areas and that removed the sign so that they could mow. And then they put the listing agent sign on a different lot. Buyers went to closing, had the survey, went to closing, and then as a celebration, went to their new lot so that they could open their bottle of champagne and celebrate where they're going to build their dream home. And they go out there and they see the red stakes on the lot next door. Actually, no, those red stakes and flags were for the lot they just bought. And it took a lot for us to find out exactly how did that placement of the sign go on the wrong lot. Well, what it revealed to me is if you're going to take a lot listing or land listing, you're going to go and check your sign on a regular basis. Yeah. And again, it took us to find out because the a listing agent said, no, I've listed many lots out in this development. This is, what we do, and then how we found out. But had that buyer gone to that property, the buyer agent taking them to that property, they would have seen what? The stakes on the survey. And then it would have been a whole different ballgame if they didn't close. It was going to be a legal battle between the buyer and the seller on something like that. But again, this is a real important lesson to know. You do it before the sale closes, right? Because in the event there's something, you're going to have to send up signals. Now, many times we're caught as buyer's agents that we have to tell them what? You need the advice of a real estate attorney. We cannot legally interpret, do you have a provision to be able to do this, to do those types of things? We have even reasonable sellers, believe it or not. On the walkthrough, something was revealed. The movers had done something wrong, forgot to cap off the water from the wash machine properly and flooded the property. There have been sellers who realize that things are bad and we just need to extend the contract so we can get this all taken care of and repaired so that we can go to closing and funding. But again, make no mistake, a walkthrough is very critical. The MLS. Now, it says the broker or agent who provides information from the MLS does not verify the accuracy of the information. The buyer should independently verify the information in the MLS and not rely on the information. Now, this information is here in this form, right? HER provided you one. It's the HER 410, the broker tenant notice. So I'm going to tell you that while this information is here, having that form signed and presented with any offer or application on a lease property is the best thing you can do for yourself, period. It's very important. So make sure that you do that. Permits. Okay, here's where a lot of buyers agents have gotten into trouble. The owners of the property were flippers. They bought the property, restored it, and did all this type of thing. Well, does that send up a red flag? Oh yeah, big time red flag. And in the seller's disclosure in section 8, they failed to acknowledge that they say, oh, we got all the permits we needed. Well, not true. But in this advisement, we tell the buyer they need to contact the local government when? During their termination option to kind of evaluate all of this. Many of these systems are online and have been for over 10 years. And so they would have it. And also the local government can say, is this a permitting process that's required for this property? I live outside of the city of Bernie, Texas. I live in the county. I don't have any permitting requirements. I found that to be crazy. And because we're a license holder, we actually had the Bernie department come out to the property. And even though I wasn't subject to it, we wanted them to inspect it to see if it met the standards of what they would have had approval process through the permits. Some people just, you have to be kind of careful in this day and age regarding something like that. Is somebody's on, I get the feedback. You need to mute yourself unless you have a question. Okay. Possession. Here's what buyer's agents need to pay attention to. The lender is the only one who's going to say when they're going to have the monies there and give approval for funding, right? Who does the funding part of it? That's the escrow agent, the title company. So if your buyer says, I'm closing at noon and I want those keys because I've got a truck that's coming in at 1 and the sellers are closing at 3, they need to be told exactly how this works. Ownership only transfers at funding, not closing. The other thing is we've had some listing agents who actually have had sellers who said, no, you don't get the keys until it hits my account. Well, that's not what the contract says. So again, let's not be promoting bad information to our clients and those types of things. Property insurance. Oh yeah, they need it before the option period expires. Karen brought up an issue where their buyer is going to be a landlord for a certain length of time and they better make sure they've covered that and have certain endorsements maybe on their homeowner's policy. School boundaries, you're not going to verify them. They are going to verify it. This is their information. They need to do all these things that concern them for this property during the termination option. Square footage. Now on this one, I'd like fireworks going off all around it. I'd like the buyers to initial sign and date it because here's what happens. Buyers agents don't do a very good job, or buyers have a short memory. When we talk about our contracts, they're only about value. It's sales price. It's not about square footage. So make sure on this highlighted area, you get everybody's initials and their date on that. Pardon me? Okay. Surveillance. As a buyer's agent, just know you and your buyers are being surveilled. Hello?
You find it?
Hello? So again, hello? Please mute yourself if you don't have a question. Okay, so just know, buyer's agents, that sellers shouldn't, record you and video you without your knowledge and consent, but let your buyers know that and make sure that you understand that. The other thing is a buyer can never photograph or record anything without the seller's knowledge or consent. This goes for you agents too. A lot of you go out there and do all these great things because your buyer doesn't have the time to do this. No, you have to have written permission in order to be able to do that. So make sure that you get written permission to be able to take pictures of a owner's property. A survey, well, I talked about that tragic story about surveys. I also tell you that I know that 6C1 of the contract using existing surveys have caused issues for our buyers. We would never recommend that they use existing surveys. We want them to obtain a survey early enough to help them understand and identify any restrictions, encroachments, encumbrances, and that type of thing to the property, because they have a provision in the contract to object to it. Tax probations, well, title companies are great. They give your buyers and sellers a document to sign that says, don't call us if y'all have a dispute over it, call each other. Well, that's what we're going to abide by. What I'm going to tell you, you might want to get a copy of that, because we don't get a copy of that. That's a title company's contract form that they do. Termination option. All buyers need to have the unrestricted right to terminate, but it says if the buyer wants to extend the option period, the buyer must negotiate an extension separately. That's in the amendment to the contract. Obtain the extension in writing. That means all parties will mutually sign it, and pay an additional fee for the extension. The buyer should not rely on any oral extensions or any text from the listing agent saying it's okay, we've got it. No, you need it all signed in order for that to be contractually binding between the parties. Wire fraud, we have separate forms for it. We have this form for it. We have it in the buyer tenant agreement. I don't care. We're going to have it in every document that a buyer touches from now until the end of time. So again, make sure that it's very important. You don't participate in providing wiring instructions, passing them along. You'll never be a part of that. And that's the best thing. As I said, this form is one, I just rushed through it, and I know these provisions back and forward, just like you do. But you need to take the time to really review this with your buyers. I think that would be a good practice to incorporate. It takes time, but it's important. What I used to do is tell the buyers, I gave them homework. And then the next time we met, usually the next day, because they didn't find a house they liked the day before, I would quiz them on the documents that I'd given them to review. And most of the time they all said, no, I live up in the hill country right outside of San Antonio. And most of them said, no, they went to have Mexican food the night before and had too many margaritas. So it was okay, but it gave us an opportunity to kind of review that form while we were visiting with each other at various times. But again, you give it to them, you tell them to review it and ask you so that you can have questions about it. Now, questions you need answered prior to an offer. I've given you this before, but I'm going to do it again because in light of the new contract changes. Is the property subject to a residential lease, fixture lease, or natural resource lease? Well, let me tell you the questions I've gotten. I've gotten where the owners of the property have a lien on the property. They don't have a lease, they're buying the solar panels. They won't have a lease on it. They have a lien that has to be paid off at closing and funding to convey the property. And I don't know about you, but it's usually been revealed that the seller can't do that. Okay, it's really sad. The other thing is I had an agent contact me and they said, okay, do I need to use, is a natural resource lease for these easements on the property? I said, those are two different things. If Exxon has a lease with the owner, they would provide it. Otherwise, it's an easement that was granted on the property. If there's a fixture lease, this is more problematic, and we're going to touch base on the form itself because not very many buyers are going to assume all these leases, and for good reason, because they're not going to be individually approved on the contract, probably for the loan. But if they can, and the lender said, yes, they can assume it, what are the requirements, the cost, what's involved in doing all of this? Because it depends upon the lease. Do you read the lease so that you can determine it? Absolutely not. Please do not do that. You're not an attorney. They need to consult with an attorney if they need to understand the lease that was provided to them by the seller. Are there any exclusions of real property that will not convey? Oh, this is a big, serious thing. I don't know about you, but you don't want to deal with this type of thing where the seller failed to notate an exclusion because the listing agent didn't help the seller and now the seller takes it and now your buyer's upset, all these different things. They usually require somebody to step in, and that usually they first get the agents involved. They think you're going to resolve all this when this is really a contractual liability on the part of the seller. Are the sellers subject to FERPA? That's what I mentioned. You'll ask it every time. I don't care if the last name is Jones or Smith. We've had a lot of them from Canada that are Jones and Smiths. So please do that. Do the sellers have any smart devices? See, that's paragraph 10. And why do you want to know that? You want to know that because you're going to tell your buyer the seller does have some smart devices. And at funding, you should receive a copy of all the smart devices, access for it, and those type of things, along with the seller saying they no longer control these devices once they've sold you their home. If the title company is chosen by seller, confirm how they handle delivery of earnest money and option fee for the buyer. You don't want to miss this step. It's very important. We've had lots of issues where, and I talked about them last time, where the option fee and earnest past the terms of the contract in paragraph 5, and all these different things that have come up on something like this. So again, be very careful about making sure that you understand the best way for buyers to comply with the contract and deposit their earnest money and the option fee. If there's an existing lease, a residential lease, and the buyer's going to assume it, they have the ability to do that. Every week, you're going to need to contact the listing agent and again ask them, is the addendum regarding residential leases 3B still true for the seller? And the reason for that is that addendum actually has a cure period where in the event the seller has got to tell the buyer, oh, they didn't pay the rent last week and they should have, and they're late and all these other things, the buyer has an option to be able to have the seller cure it. In other words, so that all those provisions in 3B will always be true. So buyer's agents, you have to keep updating on those types of things so that you make sure that this doesn't come and bite the buyer after they bought the property and become the landlord and find out that the seller did not tell them the truth on all those things. I've given you the updated buyer's checklist and the lender's worksheet. What I am going to tell you is my risk reduction committee for the Texas Realtors. It's interesting. We're being provided documents that agents are using around the state, and we're weighing in on what we think is a good risk reduction tool, or should we consider maybe doing something like this or a form, all these different types of things. And really what it comes down to is, you're in a data gathering mode when you're a buyer's agent, when you first start working with a buyer. And as a listing agent, you are as well. But when you get an offer, you do need certain data, the answers to give to your seller before they actually review their offer, so that they have a really good sense of the true sincerity and ability to be able to say, I accept this offer and I'll make it a contract. So what do you do when you receive an executed contract? You're going to verify and confirm that it has the correct executed date. If it's blank, you're going to put the effective date based upon the notice of acceptance from the other party to you. And then you're going to give it back to them and say, you didn't put this in there, so here it is. Don't wait until compliance sees that you don't have an executed date on your contract. This is something you do immediately. You take the time, you look at it, verify it, and if it's not the correct one, then you're going to get with the other agent to adjust that. If your buyer's financing, you're going to make sure you deliver the contract immediately to the lender. And what I mean by that is, we had a new agent, didn't understand they were supposed to send it to the lender. Buyer didn't know anything. And 3 weeks later, the lender finally got the contract. Well, needless to say, the lender was not able to perform based upon the closing date and other things in the contract. So again, just make sure that you're crossing all those T's and dotting the I's. I have it in the buyer's checklist as well that you should use when working with your buyers. And the time limits is an Excel spreadsheet. I don't care if you use that one, that's just as a gift to be able to cover most of the time limits in the contract and addenda, but you have to have one. You can't just leave it to chance that the buyers are going to know how to pull those dates out of the contract and addendum. That's your job. You know these contracts and addenda, you know the time limits. And what is it that your job is to assist that buyer in complying with all the terms of the contract. So again, be very careful to make sure that you use those and keep updating based upon the situations that change as well. Okay, any questions? Okay, what are we going to do next time? Well, April is Fair Housing Month. And so next month, we are going to go through the Code of Ethics and Fair Housing based on some of issues that have come up. We do this periodically. I talk about the Code of Ethics in every one of the training, but we do this periodically because it's the broker's requirements to visit with the agents regarding that. So we'll touch base on a few things that you need to kind of keep vigilant about complying with it and assisting the parties with compliance of it, much less you're upholding the Code of Ethics, as we always do in everything that we do, not only personally, but transactionally as well. So that's what we'll be doing next month. Any questions? All right, good people. I want you to stay safe and well. One day, hopefully in the future, we'll be able to be in person together. But until then, everybody take care. And I miss you a lot and hope you're doing well. Take care.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marilyn.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you, hon.
Thank you.